The chair of the African Union Commission said on Thursday that debt relief was an urgent imperative for many African states. Musa Faki Mohammed told a gathering of African heads of states at the China-Africa Summit in Beijing that there is an urgent need for diversity in the destination of investment. That summit is seen as signaling China's growing influence in a continent that it hopes can be a key ally in pushing back against a US-led global order. Chinese President Xi Jinping proposed to the assembled leaders that relations with all African countries that have diplomatic ties with China be elevated to the strategic level. He proposed 10 action plans to further deepen cooperation in industry, agriculture, infrastructure, and other areas, and further open its market.
In the 10 actions that President Xi Jinping has pronounced, we find that all of them are in line with the implementation of Agenda 2063. And we thank China for focusing on Africa's development. In the name of our common humanity, we must work together to achieve the Africa that we want, and we must work together to achieve the world that we want.
L'allègement du poids de la dette constitue pour de nombreux États africains.
For many African states, debt relief is an urgent imperative to give debtor countries' economies a vital economic breathing space. It is also desirable that, in the context of our industrialization effort, the portfolio of private investments in Africa should be sufficiently diversified to extend beyond the traditional field of mining and energy resources. In this respect, I am delighted to note that our efforts are meeting China's desire to make a decisive contribution to the modernization of the Global South, and therefore of Africa, for the emergence of a new, innovative development model.
Et donc de l'Afrique, pour l'émergence d'un nouveau modèle de développement innovant.
Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu was also in Beijing and made his own contribution to the discourse for greater focus on the growth of China's partnership with Africa as well as its real-time and projected impact. We're now being joined by Dr. Sam Amadi, who is Director of Abuja School of Social and Political Thought. It's good to have you with us on Newsday, Dr. Amadi.
Thank you and good afternoon.
All right, so how significant is the China-Africa partnership on Africa so far? What are the underlying narratives for such a partnership to take place in the first place?
Well, I think it's first, I think China is taking Africa seriously, but then it's also taking China seriously. First, this partnership didn't start today. We've seen increase for the past decade that China has been making significant incursion diplomatically and economically in Africa. China has been supporting the AU infrastructure, even in AU, trying to build capacity. Many of the states' investments directly linked to China, and of course, Chinese government and business engagement outside. Chinese companies are mostly state-owned in different dimensions and forms, and the state plays key role in helping them, tie in lucrative business deals in Africa and elsewhere. So this is a robust engagement. Now, many underlying issues. First is, as a counterpoint to the US, the Western foreign policy in Africa, China has moved from an insular anti-trade in the 1920s to insular pro-trade in the 1970s to now, and now pro-trade, again, no longer insular, trying to be a little bit more diplomatically connected and influential, again, to carve out a counter force, a counterpoise to the Western capitalist, American-led coalition and their worldview. Again, China also fancies Africa for two reasons. I mean, still Africa remains a raw material country, and so China's engine is spotting, and then again, China is witnessing some slowdown. Part of the economic analysis might be that China may lose steam and somewhat reduce growth. So in the last 2022-23, about 2%, they're projecting about 4 to 5% growth. So they need Africa to continue to grow. But again, on the part of Africa, Africa sees China as less cumbersome in terms of preaching, in terms of ideas, in terms of perhaps predicating African government to any kind of fancy ideas about human rights, transgender, sexuality, homosexuality, all of those stuff. So African leaders see that China gives you just clear bread and butter, and they do deals and move on. So it's more convenient for them. But the most strategic issue is, how would this play out in the future? If you look at Chinese own rise, from poor country to now the second largest economy by GDP and the first in price per parity, about $17.9 trillion GDP, nominal GDP, as against US 20 trillion. China didn't rise by engaging the way African countries are doing. They rose by being very adaptive, building up a nationalistic economy, having very clear-headed development framework. In fact, China and the rest of the so-called 8 high-performing Asian countries grew by, some scholars argue, by getting prices wrong. So part of what's not happening in this conversation with China and Africa is, how can Africa really do what China and a few Asian countries have done to be the real developed countries in this century, to have developed outside the Western so-called neoliberal framework, the developmental state theory. So yes, China is going to give us some investment, and of course, with that goes some debt. We see what happened in Angola and a few other places where some of these deals create indebtedness and also some domestic control. But the ultimate is that China might be getting better than we are, because they're more strategic. They understand what they need now as an emerging global and political power, and economic and political power, than African. We understand what we need from China. So we're going to see a rehash of the old, dependency theory, where probably we'll move from dependency on the West capitalists to dependence on the East. Many of us have argued that we should go East in terms of learning their strategies of development, but that's not happening. We are going there in the same, without any strategy, the way we did, just go and beg for something and get some infrastructure, and then no strategic idea about what we should actually learn from China.
But I'm wondering, won't the cost of this dependence on China be higher than it is with the United States? Because there are fears that this new relationship between China and Africa might just be signing on to a new era of colonialism or probably slavery, especially, like you mentioned, we've seen the seizure of assets and infrastructure of some African countries.
Well, yeah, it is. But the real difference here between the West and the East, especially China, is that China is not evangelical. They're not really interested in converting you to Confucian or Chinese capitalism with Chinese characteristics. So their own bondage would be financial, tie you down to maybe debts that are going to allow them to run your economy and make their extraction. So that's where the shift is. Unlike the West, that is enamored of this idealism of turning you into a fake Western country in terms of this institutional transplant that makes you look like you are a Western country, but you're not. China has not yet one of its insular, its snobbery, even disrespect for the entire world. I mean, the Chinese think they are the original people, and so they don't want to contemplate themselves. They don't want to make you democratic. They don't want you to become a human rights country. They don't want you to accept any idea from China. They just want you to do business and give them the resources. So in that case, yes, we might get into a different kind of slavery, which is now that we find ourselves tied to Chinese financial strings and exerting a return that is disproportionate, and maybe tying our assets, as we have seen in some cases. The only difference here is that, unlike the West, where we might be mentally, ideologically harnessed to their fancies, the Chinese have no such concern about the world in terms of changing their ideas or ideologies or cultural orientation. They just want to see themselves able to build. In fact, as they get wealthier, they probably would like to be more, culturally insular. But look, there's danger here for us as Africans, that we are moving into a new wave of the global economic order with no strategic tools, with no guidance in terms of what we really want from the world and what we can take from the world to enhance our situation. China was like us. I mean, as at 1980, China was half of the GDP of Russia, and today, up to a few years ago, Russia is half of China's GDP. So if you look at the data, it tells you that what we should be learning is not what we are learning. China was like us, and now China has escaped, and China has now become our Lord and Master. So I think those African leaders should sit seriously and say, look, yes, it's good to go east, but then we should go east in a strategic sense, understand how the East created their own economic miracle without depending on the World Bank. And so Nigerian government, these governments are all tied to the World Bank formula, and they're just going there, syncretism. You take Chinese capital, you are running the Western neoliberal economic system. Those capital will not aggregate in the way it did in China to state economic growth, because you need the ideas, and the way China was very adaptive, and the way China constructed its transition to market, which was really deviated from the rule book. If you don't get that part of China, then these diplomatic foray will end up just enslaving us and never getting us the capacity to be as strong and independent as China is right now. So you're right. Maybe a second colonization with a difference is now at the door.
Indeed, Dr. Amadi. So in line with what you've just said, how feasible is the issue of debt relief between African countries and, of course, China? What will be the conditions for such to be realized? We saw that resonating at this summit they just had. And why is Africa, finding it difficult to fulfill its own obligations when it comes to loan agreements with China and, of course, infrastructural development as well?
I think Chinese leaders already predict that they will struggle with loan repayment. You see, the way it worked out with the Paris and London Club under President Obasanjo, at least that era, it was part of a moral preachment, the Jubilee, and so many Bono, Geoffrey Sachs, economists, actors, everybody said, look, this is reprehensible. The most indebted countries in the world are dying for hunger and starvation, and you just have to relieve the debt. So the West was shamed, if you like, to do that. With China, it will be strategic thinking, and China will reason like, look, if these guys can pay, it's in our interest really to help them with some relief, because we are going to get deeper into the economy. So China might give us some debt relief, not because it's morally persuasive or they are ashamed, but basically because it's strategically better for them to have a breeding than a dead African country. I mean, if you are still alive, still managing to be an economy, and then China has a greater, prospect of digging deeper and taking more from you. So I see China doing a deal over these debts, and see the deal that is basically driven by the need to continue business. But back to why we really can't pay, why we do all these things. You see, it's like, don't forget that just like a decade or more, we paid off our debts. And that was a great deal in terms of momentary relief, but we didn't solve the problem that makes us go borrowing. So this is the crisis of Africa. So even if China gives us relief now and we write off these debts, we're going to accumulate more. I mean, even in the last 8 years, we've accumulated more debts, taking more loan than we've done in the previous 16 years. So what this speaks to is a central functionality in how African economies approach wealth creation, and how we also use these debts to start an economy that we can now grow and pay off, and then our use for debts might then be minimal. Again, some of the people will say, look, our debt to GDP is not that high, and therefore the US is indebted to China to more than we are. But again, these economies are robust. The revenue is high, and therefore debts are not threatened. But here are countries, hobbled, where you're using 90 to 100% of your revenue to service debt. So I see Africa talking about debts and China giving some relief, and then we getting back into the same stretch, into the same siege of highly indebted in the sense of our GDP, debt to revenue servicing, and debt to revenue servicing, and debt also to our income. So basically, I think that yes, China may give us relief, but look, it's not going to solve any problem in the long term, because we go back to borrowing, and we go back to sorrowing, and go back to begging. So except something shifts in the sense that we're able to control the politics and the economy of African states, in the sense that become more nationalistic, the sense that become more frugal and focus on productivity. That's how China did it after Chairman Mao. The rebuilding of China is a lesson in economic stoicism. You know, you have to bear the burden, you have to invest where value will come from, and you have to, you know, kind of shun off all frivolity and be very frugal and disciplined. I think that's really the issue here. Yes, at some point, if you are so indebted, there could be a moral argument to set you free so that you can pursue growth. But this is just momentary relief, and as we've seen in our own case, it rebounds back to even more dangerous form of indebtedness.
Now, Dr. Sam Amadi, Nigeria and China also agreed to strengthen the currency swap initiative and, of course, boost trade between the two countries. How will this benefit the average Nigerian?
I think, I mean, two things. If you look at the Chinese business, most of our manufacturers, their input, fabrications come from China. I think we need to do a lot more with China. But again, look, these businesses, if you look at how other countries, whether it's Taiwan, they got into their growth, it's more bilateral than multilateral, meaning that the Nigerian government has to come back and say, okay, we've opened this corridor with China. How do we really, in strategic sense, build up our industrial capacity? China started as an agrarian country, but today, 40% of its GDP is contributed by value chain from industrial sector, far more than the US with about 20%. So China is showing the way countries in underdeveloped economies grow by moving access resources level to the industrial sector. So Nigeria can also leverage on this and begin to look at our domestic industrial sector and choose champions. You know, look at areas where we have perhaps competitive advantage. Look at areas where China is now gradually becoming a high-tech economy, moved from a low-tech economy. And so China might drop off from being a major world supplier in terms of some of its wage cost is going higher. And where wage cost is high, then your competitive advantage over low-wage products becomes less. So Nigeria can imitate China, use China, and move up into that and take over some of those areas where China is now innovating away from. And so I think that it's a good opportunity for us now to sit back and go and say, how do we really use China to improve industrial sector here? Machination, send experts, bring them together, do partnerships. What is really missing is this, detailing. It's good to sign off these big, nice-sounding partnership agreements across regions, but you have to come down to your own economy, identify winners, pick champions, sectors by sector, and find twining with China and how we can transfer those technology in a way not just to use, but in a way that has spillover effect economy-wide. That's what we talk about learning by doing. And that's the driver of economic growth, innovation, arising from incentivizing your structure in a way that you learn quickly and then displace China. And if you look at the global economy, Japan did it. Korea stepped in and moved Japan off and took over that lower edge of technology. Taiwan did that. So that's the way to build up. So we need to be strategic and in a bilateral way, one-on-one, based on our own assessment of competitive advantage and where we think that China's support will rebound, sector-wide into innovation and growth.
All right, on that note, Dr. Sam Amadi, I'd like to thank you very much for your thoughts on those issues. Always a pleasure to have you.